I appreciate it. Thank you.
No worries. So as stated, this meeting is a kickoff of a superintendent search process. As a board, we have not had the opportunity to discuss this whatsoever, so I don't have any specific goals at the beginning of this meeting in terms of what we need to accomplish. I think that's something as a board that we can set, and then I'm very happy to document it, and we'll go forth from here since we haven't had a place to lay some groundwork. Now, the first thing I thought would be handy, though, would be to double check that everyone was able to see the documents that Cindy sent out on Friday. I asked her to send you some hard copies, just to make sure everyone had.
Are these the hard copies, Cindy, and this?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Just to make sure we had all this information. Thought that would be relevant as we had our conversation. And also something I did too, I was having a conversation with a board member. There were some specific questions about search firms, and so after the announcement came out yesterday, I started, I did a little additional research. And I can summarize it now. We're in the middle of the discussion. It's all right. I just wanted to let you guys know that I contacted Tricia Luba at WASDA, since she's in the leadership team, just to get her take and to see. She actually, it turns out, in her district, when she's been on the board, they have hired 2 superintendents. So she could be a great resource for us, and she offered to do that if we need. And her first piece of advice was to go ahead and call Northwest Leadership, which is the search firm that seems to come up most often. And so the leader of Northwest Leadership is a gentleman by the name of Dennis Wren. And so I called him just to ask in terms of their availability and timeline, just some fundamental questions in case it comes up in our conversation today. I didn't commit, how quickly could they come out, if we wanted a representative here to answer questions, those kind of things. So that's where I am. So to kick us off, from my standpoint, what would be good to start off today is to talk about what and when. So whether we are interested in starting to talk at the detail of searching for a permanent superintendent versus an interim, and also when we would like to initiate a search process. And that's something I was asking Dennis at Northwest Leadership in terms of, and that's why I'm very grateful Jeff's able to be here so that we can, kind of build off your experience in terms of the timeline involved, because that was something that I heard several questions from board members about. So I don't know, they're kind of conjoined questions. So just in terms of diving in, perhaps we start with the question of would we like to contact search firms immediately or not? And again, if we want to step back and talk about the process of when you contact a search firm, kind of the steps, that was in some of the materials that came out, but we could kind of summarize them. But I'm just going to throw that out in terms of what board members think about contacting search firms.
So did Mr. Ray say that they had room to take on another search?
They do.
Okay.
They do. So he is a 509 area code. He is based in the eastern part of the state, but he has 2 reps that serve our area. Actually, fun fact, Dennis Ray is a past superintendent of North Shore. He was superintendent before Karen Forrest, which I didn't realize until I started talking to him. So he's a little familiar with our neck of the woods. And he, their firm is in charge of the Snohomish and the Edmonds search right now. And so he did allude to the fact that they did have a large candidate pool for both of those searches. And I asked him in terms of, if he had anyone over here available to us to answer questions, if we wanted to start something sooner rather than later, and he did name 2 names of reps that are in our vicinity that could come meet with us. And so typically what happens is if a formal search process is conducted, then requests for proposals go out to different search firms. He did make sure that I was aware of their fee structure for conducting a search and things like that. So obviously there's some levels of detail we want to go into. And it's also, I just want to state, it's in doing research, it's been pointed out to me too, not every, and Tricia said this too, and it came up in Leanna's research from Tacoma as well, not every district goes through a search. There is the opportunity, if a board wants to appoint a superintendent, you don't have to go through the search process. that is another option as well.
My understanding was that WASDA actually recommends that you use a national search firm, not a local search firm.
So Northwest Leadership says they actually do, every search they do is a national search anymore.
But actually using a national, someone that's more nationally based. is my
So, and
understanding.
some of the, I didn't print that one out, I have the list of superintendent's firms. There was one that Tricia mentioned, Pearson and Jacobson, that's on our list. They're based in Ohio and they're national in scope. Northwest Leadership does, I believe 2 of the Edmonds candidates are from out of state. So they do, so it is an option definitely with a lot of search firms.
We used last time, or because none of us were here, Northwest, this group, correct?
Right, which-
Yeah.
So I actually think that recently WASDA made an arrangement with, WASDA used to have some in-house function for searches, but I think they actually, if you go to WASDA now, they're gonna direct you to Northwest Leadership. So I think they're kind of seen as the go-to organization in the state. And I don't want to overstep my bounds. So I would just say from my perspective, one of the things I think would be relevant would be to sort of map out a timeline. I mean, it's March 1st today, you know, administrator contract, superintendent contract year begins on July 1 and on June 30th. Maybe mapping out sort of what a search timeline would look like. And, you know, seeing what that looks like. And then I think the question would be, if you do a full search, you know, I think in a timeline you're going to be looking at probably into May, mid to late May, possibly first part of June before you might get around to interviewing. And then I think a reasonable question to ask is, what's the candidate pool potentially going to look like at that point in time? Have people either accepted positions or have people taken themselves out of search processes because that timeline is really disadvantageous for the districts that they might be leaving, so.
Yeah, I think that would be sort of reverse engineer it that way. I think the concern would be, in the first place, if you don't necessarily have to do a request for proposals, the amount of this contract is below any requirement to do that, so you could actually enter into a contract with Northwest Leadership Associates without going through this process.
And that would save us.
Or any search firm.
It depends on the dollar amount of it.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
What is does Northwest have like an entry level base level?
22,000 or something.
Yeah,
They charged Edmonds $22,800, which would be similar for us.
Yeah.
And it was like a 3-month timeline I saw. Somewhere I read that it was a 3-month timeline.
It is, so you would want, part of this has to do with what the board would expect out of stakeholder engagement up front in terms of getting feedback from the parent community, staff, in terms of critical attributes of the superintendent, that kind of engagement, getting a posting ready. They could probably reasonably come out with something around the 1st of April. You would want to typically leave that open for 6 weeks. They have my understanding the Edmonds pool was they only had 2 in hand at this point, and we're expecting more, so it depends on what you mean by large. But that still puts you into, everything goes well into mid-May, end of May for interviewing. And it is, I mean, you really have to consider what kind of candidates you're getting at that point, because people will have made commitments to a district for the subsequent year, either with their current, it might be fine to look now, depending on what kind of contract provisions are in place for a particular individual when they have to notify the board. Also have to sort of think about if a board's willing to release a candidate mid-June when a decision might reasonably be made, is there a reason they might want to be releasing that person from their contractual obligations to the district? Those are things to, seriously think about when you're thinking about the timing. It's possible, but it's very aggressive, and it's a time of the year where you're going to have to deal with those issues. Quality of the candidate pool, availability of candidates, and at the end of that, how short the transition period is. We have a lot of things going on, so if you have a situation where a superintendent comes in, Larry will be leaving on July 1st, we'll be engaged in And so what does that mean for everybody new coming in at that point? So you have to think about those things too, because no matter what happens, the students are going to show up on September 1st.
That's why I think it might be better to employ an actual national search firm, because you might get a better candidate pool versus, I understand they do national, but I'm not quite sure what that means when we're talking about national. I've heard some differences, I'm not that familiar with it, but I've heard that when you, like you said, the people out of Ohio, that they're looking at every state, not just the Pacific Northwestern states, which might give us a better pool of candidates. I think that might have been who Bellevue School District used. Or
Okay.
something like that.
Yeah, well, then you have to think about the time frame will probably likely be elongated, and then if we're talking about being able to, best case scenario with somebody, a local search firm that is indicated availability and you can enter into an agreement without necessarily going through a lengthy RFP process, and you've still got a pretty tight time frame. Making a national search and finding a national search firm and doing that just means the process would be longer. The hard and fast deadline you have is July 1st. So, basically for the CEO search processes, that's a relatively short time frame. The other thing you have to, there's a different vetting process locally than there is nationally. And, several districts that have gone through the national search process, I'm thinking of Seattle recently, and the individual left after 3 years, and they put in, actually, appointed somebody very local to lead the district. So, just have to, I think the board has to think about those trade-offs with a national search. What are you looking for that you don't think you would find locally? That time frame, how that might be made more difficult. The challenge of getting information about the candidates. Local candidates, you can do site visits. There's a lot more information that can be gathered. All those things are going to have to be considered in terms of making that decision. But, in terms of more localized search, I think Northwest Leadership Associates, I don't know what their national reach is. They certainly have a very good regional reach and a lot of good regional connections.
That's why I've heard the difference, that's more regional than national. I'd like to, I don't know what the rest of the board thinks, but I'd like to have us look at that option, the Northwest, and also a national firm, and let us know, like what Jeff's saying, he's giving us the differences, also let them outline for us, what each can do and what the differences are.
Well, which sounds to me kind of like an RFP process, which again has the timeline implications, which is totally reasonable, so.
And I don't know what anyone else's
I'm
suggestions.
just curious if a lot of the candidates that are being put up for these positions by the search firms, are they superintendents that are looking for other superintendent work? Are they people that have not been superintendents that want to move into superintendent work? Anybody have a feel for the candidates?
My sense is it would be both, David. So it would be for local folks, perhaps if they're sitting superintendents, they might be in smaller districts and they're looking for the greater challenge of a larger district. I'm thinking about perhaps the applicant pools for Snohomish and North Shore. And then you might also, again, find some folks who are looking for their first superintendent position, although those wouldn't necessarily be standard first superintendent positions, either one of those districts, just given their size. The folks you might find coming from out of state could fall into a couple of categories. Oftentimes they're retirement eligible in their current state, and so they can retire, take their pension in that state, and then go work in a different state, and so that's financially fairly lucrative for them. Or they may have particular interest in moving back to this part of the country because they've got relatives here, or maybe they were from here. I'm thinking of the Kent superintendent who was down in Georgia, came back, but had grown up in the Bellevue area, came back to Kent this year, so that's sort of another profile of somebody you might find. But more commonly for this size district, probably somebody come from out of state, be likely that they'd either be retirement eligible or they're looking to make a big jump in a district size.
So I've done a little bit of homework and got the advice from a former superintendent as well as a current director in the state that's been through 2 searches in their district. And the advice that they were kind of giving was to definitely, especially since we've had 8 years with the current tenure, and to re-engage with the community. So that community engagement piece, I think, is a valuable thing to do. And it's a good time to do that, so to wrap that in. The other options, so I think I'd be strongly in favor of doing an RFP with a search firm and doing the community engagement piece. Then in terms of the options for superintendents, was clarified that, you know, you could do, especially if you do an interim, you know, where would you find that interim? And so kind of common pools would be internal candidates or kind of retired people that just kind of do interim work as superintendents, and there's people that there's pools of that. And then that would be perhaps like intended to be a short-term, 18, 20, 2 years, 6 months, whatever that might be. And then also looking at the full. So, and it's my understanding that the RFP can be tailored to our circumstances. So assuming we wanted to have a community engagement piece, seek for a candidate pool, and we could, you know, I know like for faculty appointments or dean appointments, you could say, you know, for tenure track or for non-tenure track, you're open. So you could be looking for a long-term kind of a permanent position or a short-term position. That may not be the norm, but you could do that anyway. You can write those job descriptions in the call, and we have to talk to the experts in that field to see, you know, what that would do. So, so I think those are some of the advices that I received, and certainly the citizen engagement piece I think is useful. The other one piece of advice was on the search firms, and this individual, their board had sent out the RFP for the search firms, and they had interviewed 3 search firms, and they were not comfortable with any of the search firms. They got a 4th one, and then they ended up doing that. So I think, and I don't know, I didn't have a chance now that I'm hearing this, that, you know, Northwest is kind of the alleged go-to one here, then, you know, did they use them or find out? But I think vetting the search firm is as important as vetting the superintendent candidates. And so that was the advice. And then certainly the timing, I think we're in a very time-constrained position. So that has to influence the thinking, but I'm still kind of, that's the advice I got.
So I have a question, Jeff. The contracts go from July to June. Does that mean that there's not any, I mean, I understand that your pool would be smaller, but let's say we don't find anyone by June, we need to appoint an interim. Does that mean that you cannot, that there's not anyone available to hire kind of mid-year? That you really, then you have to wait all the way to the next year?
Practically speaking, yes. At least in Washington State, administrative contracts run from July 1st to June 30th. That's statutory. That's the term of an administrative contract. You have to think about who's available, would be available in the middle of the year, and why they're not employed somewhere, either as in a lower level position. I mean, assistant superintendents, deputy superintendents apply for superintendencies, or why they're not working as a superintendent. If you were looking for somebody long-term, that would be, I mean, you have to take that into consideration, who's available at that time. It's pretty unusual unless something unusual happens mid-year. For instance, when Karen Forrest passed away, that was an unusual set of circumstances. At that time, the board appointed an interim and then did a full search, and that's when Larry was hired. I can't, or if there were some major disagreement between the board and the superintendent, and the board chose to buy out the superintendent's contract, that might be another reason why a position was open mid-year. That's also why a candidate might be available mid-year. And so,
Or it could be people looking for a promotion, or...
they're under contract. Yeah. And
So their district will never let them out of the contract to go somewhere else?
it's highly unusual.
Really?
Unless they want to let them go, and there's a reason, they just as soon see them go. And
Because I'm under contract too, that's why I'm asking, because I'm under contract too, but if I were to get a job somewhere else, I could essentially go to my boss and say, I found this job, and they could keep me to the contract, but they'd probably be like, no, we want to see you move forward. So that's why I'm asking that question.
Yeah, well, in public education at a certain level, I mean, we do that with teachers. If somebody finds a job and we can find a replacement, we've released people from their contract obligation with us. But in fact, we just had a situation with a principal, or assistant principal, that had signed a contract, and it put us in a really difficult position finding a replacement for her, and we finally did release her and found an interim. But most districts are very, most districts would not agree to release a top-level administrator mid-year.
Now, other districts, I'm thinking of the different school cycles they might be on. So there's some year-round schools. So Washington State is, like if we're looking at another state, so Washington State is the July through the June. But other states, out of the 50 states, they might be on a year-round schedule. They might be on it, their contracts may go like from August. I mean, there could be different timelines because there are different, I know there's several districts or states that do year-round school.
Yeah, I don't think,
So,
I think the general, I'm not familiar with all the contract law in all the other states, but I think it would be, again, doing it out of cycle changes your applicant pool, increases the chance that you're getting somebody that is going from something, not to something, if you know what I mean by that. They're living in a situation that's not good. And I know here, if any of our top-level administrators told us in December, I've decided to take a job somewhere else to release me from my contract, we would say, no, we're not going to do that. Unless there were really extenuating circumstances for doing that. Is it impossible to find somebody? I wouldn't say it was impossible. It's really difficult, and the applicant pool is different, and you would have to look really careful at those applicants that are available then.
So I'm just, this notion of the contract law and not being able to renew from a contract is not my understanding of business law and contracts. So unless this is something that's unique to law, I mean, typically contracts are built in a way for the parties to be able to enter into, exit those contracts. So when you say a contract can't be exited, that's not my understanding of contracts.
Well, so what we would do if the contract binds us and binds the employee, it binds us more than the employee. As an attorney pointed out to me once, it's not indentured servitude, right? So but we could go to court to enforce contract terms. That's not really the issue. The issue is it's widely considered, especially in Washington State, as bad form. So if somebody broke their contract with another district to come to us, I think you would concur with this, viewed as a kind of an act of bad faith. I mean, you signed on to work for that, especially in a high-level position, you signed on to work for that district for that contract term, and then to say, well, I know I have a contract with you, but I dare you to enforce it, and I'm going to leave. Now, that doesn't mean some circumstances come up and people are asked to be released from a contract, and the district releases them from a contract. Like I say, we do that with teachers all the time. We did it with the principal, but it was difficult for us to find a replacement, and we didn't release her until we found a replacement. And I think the higher up you go, the higher stakes it is for the organization for somebody to leave mid-year. And again, I agree with you, Ken, it's not impossible to do that. We're unlikely to want to go through the trouble and expense of trying to enforce a contract in court, but I think that it's seen as an act of bad faith, and then the other district is saying, I wonder why that person left in the middle of the year. We don't, I don't know, I've been doing this for a long time, and as a matter of form, we don't do that sort of what I call poaching from other districts, is going after people mid-year, and we don't do that with teachers either. It's just one of those things that we try to respect the employee's contractual obligations to their current district, and which is why a lot of, I mean, almost all of our hiring with certificated employees, whether administrators or teachers, is on that cycle, so that we don't put people in that position. They can leave at the end of their contract term and come to work for us. So I think that's more of a culture issue with public education than a matter of law, if that makes sense.
So just so we have access to the best pool of potential candidates, what's that time frame? Is it June, May? I mean, when is that best time of the year?
For a superintendent?
Yeah.
We should be including it now.
So February, January?
So generally, and I'm going to say just my experience being hired into this position, or the position I was just hired into, those positions were posted and advertised in November, and then close end of January, and then over the next month to 6 weeks, the selection process takes place. That's generally considered sort of the ideal spot. Usually, for most administrative positions, including superintendents, that's sort of the time of the year, that December, January timeframe, where people start looking. Because as Jeff said, usually they're pretty ingrained in their positions at that period of time, and they're not looking to move during that contract year. But if they're interested in a move at the end of the contract year, that's generally where they start sort of popping their heads up. So I would say that ability to post in November would be, sort of around Thanksgiving, between Veterans Day and Thanksgiving would be the most ideal.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Yeah, Edmonds, I have the schedule that our first leadership associate put out. I think that opened at the beginning of January, which even that was pretty late for.
And oftentimes your ability to do that depends on what are the circumstances through which you now have a vacancy. Often, the very polite and beneficial thing for superintendents, say, who are retiring to do is to make those announcements, get the school year started in September, and usually make those announcements in October. And usually they've been having those conversations probably with the board prior to that, so that it doesn't come as a complete surprise. And then that allows them to move forward. If someone's had a change in life circumstances, or as in my circumstance, have taken a different position, that presents a different timing issue for the district potentially.
I have a question. So in terms of the search for an interim versus a long-term superintendent, is the timeline any different? Is it to look for an interim superintendent this time of year because it's a shorter duration? Is it simpler? Now I'm thinking about the time I'm involved in just finding someone for July 1st.
Yeah, so the board always has the authority to appoint a superintendent, and so typically an interim is an appointment rather than you go through a search process. So I think Ken, you rightly pointed out that applicant population is either an internal one or a retired superintendent is most common. There's either somebody internally or there's somebody who's available to come out of retirement to do that. In that case, it can be done whatever timeline you want it to, because you're not putting out a posting, you're just finding out who might be available and interested in a good fit for that whatever interim period you're looking for. You're offering a contract, and that can be done in relatively short order. And typically, like I said, there wouldn't be value in doing a search at that point. I mean, you're really just, doing an informal process of finding out who's available. And then part of that decision-making is, especially in the context of the next couple of years and a lot of complex moving parts and challenges coming up, is, when is an optimum time for a new superintendent to come in after doing a search? Is that do you look at some kind of, appointment of 2 years to get through next year and get through the transition year with a new high school? Those would be decisions you'd have to think about as well. What's going to be attractive to somebody? what might be attractive to a retiree might not be attractive to an internal candidate in terms of wanting, to know that they're going to have this much time to accomplish all the work that needs to be done in terms of grade reconfiguration and opening the high school and the boundary adjustments. So those are things to think about as well.
The other thing, and I don't know if you had this conversation with Dennis when you spoke with him, but search firms are also, or have also been retained to identify potential interim candidates for districts as well.
That's what I thought.
I didn't ask him that question, no.
You can certainly,
Right.
I think the scope of the contract would be a lot smaller.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've heard that, or, my limited understanding of it is that districts have used retired superintendents who really don't, they just want to come out and do this for a year. They know what they're doing, but they don't have a tie to want to stay, right? But yet they're committed for the time period that they're here.
Yeah, and that's,
Right.
and you'll see more of those. There's probably a handful across the state in any given year. You'll see more of those things happening the later you get into spring, where districts will start making that move. For instance, Renton currently now has an interim, and that's a very defined two-year assignment, and then they'll move out again. I believe that the Seattle superintendent was brought in technically as an interim, and then over time that worked into more of a permanent position, but the initial entry was as an interim.
Can you poach superintendents from other districts?
I think that's.
Can you or should you? We already know the second answer is you should not generally.
I was kidding.
Yeah.
That
I
was
think from the superintendent level to ask the board, think about how you would act as a board if the superintendent came to you and.
I was kidding.
Yeah.
I was being funny.
I would say as well that, in joking aside, that most superintendent contracts probably contain a similar provision as mine does, where there is a mutual intent notification date, so that, there are no surprises of that nature. And it would be, again, as Jeff said, probably not impossible, but it might be bad form for somebody to consider doing that. And those kinds of things, it can be a very small world. And those kinds of things, particularly if a board feels like they've been, disadvantaged in some way, can follow people in unhealthy ways.
So I have no one in mind, by the way, for the record.
You have no what?
I have no, I'm just
No
clarifying,
yes.
Okay.
because we're too now
So I do have a question about that intent.
snowballing.
Intent clause and how that works that's useful for planning purposes or whatever, but if a plum job comes available, and I know that the North Shore School District is a plum job for many people who would like to be a superintendent. We're a very attractive school district for a host of reasons. So if a superintendent, especially say at a half size or smaller size district in the state, and all of a sudden, oh wow, North Shore is available. I've always wanted to be the superintendent at North Shore. Now that's available. I've already given my intent letter to my school board, but now that North Shore is available, so how would that superintendent, we'll call him Superintendent Q.
I would say, just for myself personally, I think that would go largely to the relationship between the superintendent and his or her board. So has the superintendent had the conversation with the board over time about what their future aspirations are? That at some point, if there was ever this plum job, that's my aspiration. So what would be, how much would that match sort of what the ongoing dialogue and relationship has been, even if the superintendent has already provided their intent to return the following year? So if that's in place, I could see a board perhaps being more willing to look at accommodating that, but the board also has to consider the best interest of the district, not necessarily the best interest of the individual. That's their role. So they might be accommodating with that if that's been a part of the dialogue, or they might feel that that maybe that should have been part of the intent statement prior, which is, I do intend to return next year, but I just want you to know if one or two of these plum things come along, I would really like the opportunity to explore that.
And then that intent, again, I'm not a lawyer, but we have to take business law class. That intent phrase would not be a binding. That's a thoughtful thing to do and to say, but it's really not a contractually binding thing. But in terms of the professionalism and those other things, it would be very problematic to.
I would say it's a professional courtesy and that it serves both interests.
Right, so if that person hadn't communicated with their board, but this position came in, their path would probably be to go contact their board and say, hey, even I haven't told you this before, but this job is now available, and I think I'd like to, you know, so that would be a conversation that they would probably, so, and then this is what you're talking about in terms of limiting the pool. There could be people who've given their intent who would apply otherwise had they not given their intent, and then.
I would be.
I was gonna say the opposite of that is true, maybe it's just too many years of HR work, is that sometimes people that are, the board's perfectly happy to release them from their contract aren't necessarily the people we want. So you have to sort of be aware of that too.
And I would just say that if a board reacted negatively to, you know, here's this plum opportunity and I want to pursue it, and the board reacted negatively to that, I would think if it were me or any other superintendent, you would want to think carefully about moving forward, because that recommendation from your board, I mean, that's the most critical recommendation a board is probably looking for when they hire a superintendent, is what does the other board say about them? And so if your board did not respond positively to that, you would want to think about moving forward. And
Do boards give recommendations?
yes.
But we didn't recommend for your job, I don't remember. Is that because it's a different type of job?
I don't know who they contacted for reference checking, but it wouldn't be uncommon to contact the board.
And that's maybe what's involved in the site visit. How are the questions going?
So-
Director Hayes thing.
Well, I guess, my overall question is, do we want to view this as a crisis or as an opportunity? And depending on which way you want to view that, that sort of changes the timeline. If this is a crisis, we have to ram this through by July 1st. If it's an opportunity, you know, let's get the best out there and take our time to make sure we've got them. But I have a, you know, absolutely, community needs to be involved. I'm a little concerned that they may be saturated, just because last night I got 3 robocalls about a meeting tomorrow night of surveys, and in 60 days, can we squeeze in yet one more survey into our community that they will take seriously and be thoughtful about? And it's more than just a superintendent. I mean, it's really that big picture of where are we headed for the next 10 years, and visioning and mission and all those things that we've been talking about we want to do. And I just worry that that's going to get lost in the shuffle of all of the surveys that we've sent out in the last couple of months. Perhaps when we've got sort of next steps figured out, then we can get in and say, okay, now that we've got 2017 dealt with, then what? Who are we going to be, and what does that look like, and who do we want to come alongside and lead us in that direction of where we're going to go?
So I agree. I think it is an opportunity, and I think whether we do it sooner rather than later, it's an opportunity. I don't think it needs to be crisis in any manner. But I think the other thing to think about is there'll be another election in 2000, less than 2 years. And so if we're talking about appointing someone and then having a new board come on and have to get up to speed because there's 2 of us that may be changing, may not be changing, I think there's that risk too. So thinking thoughtfully about, and I'm not married to, I have to be the person on the board. I'm saying if you're thinking about transitions, that transition requires getting people up to speed and all that. So for me, I think it's more important that at least we have that timeline up, that be a timeline that we have gone through that process and picked somebody before we go through another election cycle. And like I said, not about myself, but about what that entails to bring new people on, and if there were to be new people.
Ken just asked what I thought, and I was sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, I was just, I'm sorry, Sandy, I don't mean it contrary, I'm saying.
There's always,
I on top of that.
every 2 years, there's going to be a board changeover, so that's going to, I don't know how we run our lives around an upcoming board election. I was just thinking in terms of the community and then being able to be part of this decision, and we've already started some conversations about wanting to include in the budget process and that type of thing, and this just seems to fit so nicely with that overall timeline. And then the other thing is skill set. The skill set we need for a leader for this district for the next 18 months is very detail-oriented, very change management oriented, very project oriented, and we would bring somebody in and say, okay, just don't change anything for the next 18 months, don't touch the system. And then we'd say, okay, now, what would you like to do? You know, who are we gonna become, who is North Shore in the future? And those, we may get lucky and find the person that has all of those skill sets, but I don't know if we can do it in 122 days. I just like the idea of, okay, let's figure out who we want to be and who we want to become, and what does our community see us being, and that we get somebody that's going to be with us for 10 years, right, 10 years, and that we have those conversations of where are we headed, and that we get somebody that says, that matches my visions too, and I want to help guide that along. That's my thought.
So I'll go next, and then maybe we'll get some of David's thoughts. I'm starting to hear, again, we have a couple different decisions to make, whether we, again, try to fill long-term by this July 1st or go with an interim. And I feel like we're having good discussion about that for sure, and so that's where I want to weigh in as well. I'm definitely, so far everyone that I've taken notes for is looking for a RFP process to make sure we have that full community engagement. That's where I'm falling as well, definitely. I think that I want to find the best person for the job, and if that means we have to take longer time, I think that's a good investment in the district in order to make sure that we have I agree with you, Ken, I think we are an attractive district, and we want to time it so that we have the optimum pool to choose from. And so that's why I'm in favor of having the longer term time frame, both in terms of having the best applicant pool, as well as having that full community engagement process. In terms of how long an interim, that would be our next conversation, I feel. And so, I have to say I am concerned about the timing of the 2017 election. I think it's it's the trickiness. It is right after North Creek opens, but I want to make sure that there's a foundation, but at the same, I have to say, I'm still, I don't know if we need to decide that today in terms of the period of the interim. I still think, though, you have a good point, Sandy, in terms of having an implementer to get us to fall of 2017 versus someone that can build. I'm going to be all about implementation till we get to September 2017. So that's where I'm falling. Would you like to share some thoughts, David? What do you think?
Yeah, I'd be interested to, I guess first off, I think that we are in the best position to make the best choice if we have the best candidate pool available. I think the timing means we're too late to do that in time for July 1st of this year. So I agree, I don't see this as a crisis, more as an opportunity to be thoughtful about the process. I would be interested to know who would be interested in working in this role in the now term, in the July 1st timeline. And then I think if we have an opportunity to have a search posted early November, and then we take all interested parties and evaluate that, come to some kind of conclusion. I think that's a thoughtful approach.
That sounds good. Now, Kimberly and Ken, actually, I didn't make a note. do you have any thoughts? Would you like to weigh in on whether the long-term for July 1st or interim for July 1st?
So I'll go back to, I think, after hearing everyone, and what I think I heard is the advice from the other people. I think, well, I guess I have one comment, and I'll do that.
Mhm.
And having been in academia, we go through searches all the time. Like, we search for faculty, we search for deans, provost presidents. So one of the errors I think people make is they focus on the pool instead of the person. We're not gonna hire a pool of 20 people, you hire one person. And so you're looking for one person. Now, it's correlated. The better pool you get, usually you get a good person, but you're looking for the one person that's gonna have that job in the district and is allowed to have one superintendent. And that's the only employee that we, the board, has. So I'm not opposed to having a great pool, but you can have a great pool, and I've seen this happen way too many times, and then you don't get a great person, you hire one person. So, and I think the knowing that the superintendent is really chosen in basically a contractual relationship between the five of us and that individual. And so I think focusing on I think we can over-focus on the pool rather than the person. Given that, I think the community engagement process is a time-consuming, is a thing, but as the five of us, it's our number one job. And so the fact that there's other voices that are competing for that attention, I think we have to focus on that job, and we have to have a superintendent. And we have to have that by July 1. This crisis and opportunity, I think it's some of both. It depends on how one wants to do that. I think it's way more opportunity. I think we're very attractive. and especially because of there are these kind of career interims. I think that market, we're probably early in the phase for lining up that kind of a market and seeking that out. So I think, at least in that sense, that's useful. And I don't think any of us know the quality of the one person that we're looking for to look for a full-time superintendent that we would have, a more permanent one. You give a 3-year contract with the expectation of a long term. So I think my sequencing would be to get multiple RFP, or send an RFP and get multiple back from the search firms for us to do, because we haven't had a chance to talk about it, and for us all to go out and do as much talking and understanding and learning. I had a chance to do that with 2 people. I'd like to do it with 10 people who've been through these kinds of things and learn and understand. I think we'll probably hear a lot of what we saw in the materials that we read. And I think we should do that post-haste as quickly as possible. And then I think we should leave it open to the advice we receive back from and the conversations we have from those people as to whether or not we would want to do a full search or an interim search. I think we should know that we can find a quality interim, because that's a market in which we're completely on schedule with. And so I think we should take confidence in that. And then that allows us, I think, the time to, because if any kind of a situation, if you feel rushed or pressed, you're going to make a mistake. And I don't think we should feel that. I think we have great resources. I think we're extremely attractive, and there's no need to make the mistakes of hurrying. And so I would like the RFP. I would like to keep open. I think it's way too early to choose whether or not we're looking for a full or an interim. And I think it's very clear that we will be able to find a fabulous interim if we can't find a fabulous 3-year contract type superintendent.
All right, Kimberly, I want to give you a chance to, do you have any, do you want to, since you started, do you want to circle back around? Do you have any, yeah?
So I've liked what everybody said. I think that there's pieces that are, pieces to the lens we're all looking through that are, that I'm comfortable with. I do think that hiring before 2017 is important. So that's my reasoning, and I think that, I think personally it's important to get someone in here that is going through this boundary change process. We have a great administration here, and we have Ryan back there, and all these people that have already, a lot of the decisions are already made. I think the most important decisions made were the boundaries, and the next big decision is gonna be the curriculum changes, and that would happen most likely before a superintendent comes in. I think the timeline's for May. So I think the big decisions, am I correct on the junior high, the middle school task force, that they're gonna have a recommendation by May?
Or definitely before July 1st.
Yeah, so before July
Definitely safe
1st.
to say
So I think
before
that
July
a
1st.
superintendent coming in, before 2017, that for them to get a feel of what we're going through with a great administrative staff behind them that is doing the majority of the work would be important, that that person is recognizes the changes that are going on before they come in with all these, if you come in at 2017, let's say towards the end of 2018, and there's always gonna be problem and change. They could be like trying to pick up a bunch of these pieces versus coming in ahead of the curve somewhat and knowing what to anticipate. Knowing, here's the changes we're going through with bringing our high school, 9th grade up to the high school and our 6th grade up to the middle school, and getting them on board with that, because many of these people might not have gone through that transition, right? They might have already had these changes in their system years ago. And so to be able to be a part of that process while it's already solidified but hasn't actually been implemented, in my opinion, is important. So, and those would be my reasoning. I'm in the same lane as Ken after hearing you talk, that I think it's okay to have an interim. I prefer to hire somebody, so I'd like to see us do RFPs and see have them, they do this all the time, they know what to expect, and I appreciate what Jeff's saying, and I love that insight and Larry, but I think also at the same time, hearing what they have to say, we've done a search this late, here's what here's how it's turned out, here's what we can do for you, and then if that's not a viable option based on what these search firms are telling us, then looking for an interim and then doing our superintendent search next year. I think we have a board that will have, is engaged and involved, and it would be important work of us to do that while we are all here before more changes potentially may occur. So did that make sense, what I?
That does, so just to make sure I understand what you're saying is to, again, go and talk to some search firms and, again, evaluate both options of searching for an interim and searching for a long-term for July 1st. And when we go through the RFP process, speak with the search firms about both those options. Am I summarizing that correctly?
Yeah, and I think you see this with major corporations that have some of the same, it's not a public institution, I recognize that, but they might have a CEO search and they have a pool of 200 people, and out of those 200 people, someone doesn't pop up and they need to then appoint someone interim. And I like what you said, Ken, it's about a person. Well, yes, if you're looking at it statistically, the more people in the pool, the more chance there might be for that perfect match, but that doesn't mean that if there was a pool of 3 people that you don't have a perfect match. So, waiting I don't think gets you any more than doing it now. Doing it now might help us to weed out and see, okay, what is this process about, and kind of help to see who's out there, and if we don't feel like there is anyone out there that matches our needs, that we could appoint an intern. But I think we should talk to the search firms first. I think that's the first step. And I think we as a board need to be committed, because I've asked for this meeting now for at least 6 weeks. So I don't think that we can wait. I want to say I'm frustrated about it, but it's, I've wanted to start this process a lot sooner. And so I think that, we need to be committed that, we're all going to, whether it's by phone, because I know you travel and I'm often at work, that we're committed to, when these proposals get together, we find out more about these search firms, that we're able to come together for an hour and talk about it, or whether we extend our public meeting by an hour or come in an hour earlier, that we know that we're going to have more of a commitment in the next month to,
So, I'm a little confused as to what we're doing with the RFPs. Are we looking for RFPs to assess feasibility of doing this in the next 122 days? Or are we looking for RFPs to actually do a superintendent search? Because I've heard two different things.
My understanding was that you do an RFP for search firms, and you basically say, we're looking for a search firm, who wants to be our search firm?
Okay.
And so you call up Northwest Associates, and then there's a list that we got in the thing that had like 12 names on that. So you send them an email and you say, we're looking for proposals for a search firm to assist us in our superintendent search.
But what is the filter I'm looking at when I'm looking at it? And am I looking at, I'm reading the RFP, and am I reading it for, yes, this is something that can happen, and at that point it'll be 92 days, right? This is something that
well,
can happen
it
in
could
the
be
next.
next week.
Well, okay, but, you know, in this very short timeline, or am I looking at it, this is the search form I want to go with to pick my superintendent? Do you understand the difference in how
No.
the filter?
I think Jeff may be able to,
Well, I think you have to think about what the RFP says and what you're
Okay.
asking for. If
Well,
you're
that's
asking
what I-
for proposals from search firms to conduct a search for a superintendent as soon as possible with the idea that you would hire somebody by July 1st, that's different than making a request for proposals to help the board evaluate its options.
Thank you, that's much better way of phrasing what my
That,
question was.
you know, kind of determining what the interim pool might look like versus what the feasibility of doing a search this late in the year for a superintendent, if, you know, one kind of want to externalize that, the advice to the board on that matter. I guess you'd have to ask the search firms those questions.
Yeah, so that's great clarification. So the three things I would be thinking of is, that I would ask a search firm is, have you done a search this late? Because maybe some of them haven't. What is the, like you said, what's the quality of applicant or the pool in the searches that you've done? How does this timeline match with the search firm's expertise or ability? I'm sure most of them can do a search within this short amount of time, but we don't know that. And then,
I think you're talking about how we would evaluate the search firm.
No, I'm saying these are questions I would ask the search firm.
Exactly, but I
Yeah.
think the question about the RFP is, what would we ask them to give us a pitch on? And so you can make that very specific, or you can make it more broad. So you could say, so if we were in November, we'd say, we're looking for a superintendent, we want to do a full search, we want to communicate the process that Edmonds had because they had a retiring superintendent. And you'd ask for that package, and that's a known package. Everyone in the industry understands that, that's what it'd be. Since we're at a tighter timeline, it's important contractually to say, here's exactly what we're asking for. And so if I can try and draft what I think I'm proposing we ask for, is we'd ask for search firms to give us a proposal on finding our superintendent to be selected by July 1. And that we would be open to a process, where we would need that process to look for a interim, or what would they call permanent, whatever you call that kind of a thing. So that's the request, that the search firms would give us their proposal on that. And so then they would come in and say, we think you can't do a full search with a fidelity or whatever, only an interim, and here's how we would pitch you on the interim. When they do that, that's an invitation to dance, an invitation to have a contract with them. So their pitch, they could give us, you know, I've done pitches when I was a CPA, so they could give us here's what our full-time search would look like. It's 22,000, it's compressed and includes all these things. It's the menu that they got. Here's what our cost would be if you're just gonna do an interim. And if you wanna dabble in both and keep both your options open during the search, it's gonna be this. So in some sense, you're saying, here's what a full search would look like, here's what an interim search would look like, and then if you wanted to do both, I guess. And then they can respond to us if they want to enter into a contract with the 5 of us on that process. I think that would be.
Yeah, and one of the things you just want to make sure, so the search firms are in the business to make money. So you have to think about, if a search firm may very well say we can do a search in a very short period of time and get you the superintendent